Right. Good evening, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. And I'm going to speak in English, obviously. I'm going to speak quite fast. Thank you very much to ICEERS for opening this space for a very complicated and perhaps contentious subject, which I'm about to bring up. We've had a really excellent talk, I think, from Liana about some of the potentials for science. I'm going to be talking about some of the limitations of science, how we approach them and incorporate them. So, this talk comes from a question that was raised on an ayahuasca academic list that I was the librarian of. It's in fact the list which Danny was talking about, produced that response to the ESC. So I was librarian of that list until I basically got myself kicked out. And the question that arose on this list was, can ayahuasca cure cancer? Somebody sent this in. And the academics put their heads together and they came up with the following answer. There is no data about ayahuasca curing cancer. Which I thought was a rather interesting answer. Philosophically, what does data mean? And also they said there may be anecdotal reports, which again is interesting. What constitutes knowledge? And yeah. So the other thing was the human aspect of this. This was clearly someone dying of cancer who'd asked the question. I have two friends who would say that they have cured cancer with ayahuasca, and I'm going to tell you about what I cured with ayahuasca. But does this count as knowledge? Are these academics racist? So I'm going to be asking this question a lot about racism and neocolonialism. No, clearly they're not racist. However, does science privilege one way of viewing the world over another? I would say yes. I would say there are structural neocolonialist elements in science, or let's say scientism, or in how the academy works. And we're going to be talking about them. So this is my anecdotal report. When I was much younger, I was living in the Brazilian Amazon and I got leishmaniasis. I got bitten by a sandfly and it developed into that. It's a horrible kind of ulcer which can develop into a form which attacks the cartilage in your nose and ears, and people lose the cartilage in their body. And so I'd gone to Brazil in order to learn about ayahuasca in my tradition, which is daime, and I decided to treat it with daime, and everyone thought I was crazy. They said I had to take injections of antimonium tartrate, which is a heavy metal, into the bones, and not into the bones, into the veins, sorry. And I didn't want to do that for a number of reasons. I'd gone there to learn about the power of ayahuasca, and that's what I was going to do. So I decided to treat it with ayahuasca. And this was the medicine I used. It already contains two plants. We've already heard about how complicated it is to standardize, to assay those kind of things from a scientific perspective. But my treatment also contained ritual, plenty of ritual. Ritual involving lines about, for example, this cures everything, this expels anything with the power of the Eternal Father. This is part of the magic of my tradition. This is what my tradition says. This is not apparently what the science can say at the moment. It raises another question. Can the Eternal Father cure cancer? I also used frog medicine. I used the bark of several trees on my wound. I also went to visit Barquinha, where a slave incorporated into the body of a medium, gave me advice on how I should treat my disease, gave me some leaves that I had to pass over it and throw into the river, gave me a series of prayers, and so on and so forth. And of course there's Mestre Ireneo, who's the progenitor of my lineage, without whom, can we say this thing, it's not really daime. Anyway, my question is, how can science assess all of these very complicated things? And the answer is, it can't assess all of these very complicated things. As we've seen, it can focus on some very specific things. So anyway, I got better. I lost 10 kilos. I lost an ex-wife. Lost plenty of things I didn't need. And towards the end of my cure, I also met this woman who nursed me back to health. And we had a couple of children. I was celibate the whole time, and after that I wasn't, and she became pregnant. And this is one of my daughters, Sophia. This is the other one, Janaina. They were both born with birthmarks where I had my wound. There you can see another image. I took this to my curandero, and I said, "Look at my magic." And he said, "Oh, it left a tag, did it?" Because this is very common in the context of Amazonian medicine, this kind of thing. Absolutely normal, in fact. It barely raised an eyebrow. So, is this significant? No. In science, this is what significance is. This is what's called magical thinking, and this is what primitive people do. Can science assess this? Science can assess one part of the puzzle. That's not a limitation of ayahuasca, that's a limitation of science. So we're going to look through, it's good to look at the present through a lens of history. What happened in the 1870s with Chinese medicine in Australia? There was a diphtheria outbreak. 1 in 2,000 people were dying, often children. It swells up the throat. Sometimes families would lose 3 children in the space of a week. Very tragic situation. So no one really had any medicine for this except for Chinaman John, whose real name was Ah Su. And he was very successful using a bamboo pipe to blow a mixture of powders down the throat of infected victims, and he was very successful with this. So a trial was organized. In 1874, it was proposed that Ah Su would conduct this trial. That was not to happen. In fact, he wasn't allowed to conduct it. Australian physicians decided they were going to conduct it, and they found that it didn't work. So anyway, Ah Su's success continued, so he decided to, or he didn't decide, a chemical analysis was proposed. And it was conducted by Dr. Blair, who gave his expert technical interpretation of the facts. The Chinaman's powder contains nothing new. A list of what it does contain, zinc sulfate, etc. These necessarily act as astringents, caustics, escharotics. In the hands of an ignorant man, these local applications would be productive of a grievous amount of harm. Ah Su is an ignorant pretender. Was Dr. Blair racist? Yes, I think he was. So we have authority, questions of authority, questions of racism, and questions of arrogance in this man. But more specifically, we also have some tropes which we see in the ayahuasca world as well. Clinicians performing the trials, not people who are the keepers of the traditions performing the trials. Reductionism, breaking something into its parts, breaking something into its molecules. I'm not saying we shouldn't do this, but that is not the whole story. There is more to this stuff that was being blown down the throat than escharotics. Focusing on the theory and ignoring the data, and assuming the ignorance of the practitioners and keepers of the lineage. Also, the fatal consequences of this arrogance. Lots of people continued dying because not only was Ah Su not allowed to perform, but Chinese doctors, from then on, they were forbidden from calling themselves doctors. Dr. Blair berated the press and the authorities and the public for allowing this kind of nonsense to continue. So, let's have a look at how these tropes appear in modern science. This is a particular study which established the dose response of ayahuasca. So this was, they used freeze-dried ayahuasca. I don't know if you've ever seen that in the jungle. 3 of the sample were excluded for vomiting, which is a funny way to study ayahuasca. And the conclusion was that this approach can identify dose response. Now, if any of you are familiar with ayahuasca know that it's got a very strange dose response. I've seen someone take 13 glasses and be absolutely fine. I've also seen someone take literally a drop of Daime because he didn't want to take any more. He was on antibiotics, and he was on the floor for the rest of the session. He was flying. I asked him about it afterwards. He said it was very, very strong indeed. Dose response. Now, in my tradition in Daime, pregnant women will drink ayahuasca, drink Daime through their whole pregnancy, and even when they're giving birth. Ashaninka women, I believe, shamans will also drink. They may reduce their dose towards the end of their pregnancy. So this is a test on. It was a study into. Ayahuasca and pregnancy. And the conclusion is that daily use by pregnant women may pose risks for the conceptus, and it was developmentally toxic. And also, they concluded for this reason it shouldn't be used, children shouldn't have it as well. This was published in Isto, which is the second biggest magazine in Brazil. Right, so what did they use? They used 8 times the equivalent dose on the rats than you use on humans. and rats can't vomit. So, again, not a particularly good test, not really very reasonable, I think. Nearly half of the rats died. Water in 8 times its normal dose will kill you as well. Thank you. So what about Dymista knowledge? What about Shipibo knowledge? It doesn't really fit in. This was another study sponsored by Berkeley. Ayahuasca enhances creative divergent thinking. What they did was they fed ayahuasca to people. They, clinicians, fed it to people. And they presented them images like this and said, how many things can you find which a umbrella and a squirrel have in common? And if you drink ayahuasca, you find more things in common. That enhances creative divergent thinking. Okay, it's research, we got some knowledge out of it. Jeremy Narby, when he published his book, The Cosmic Serpent, and no one would review it, and he got upset about this. New Scientist reviewed it, they called it hogwash. And he said, oh, well, screw you, I'm going to do some science. And no one wanted to fund him on the research that he proposed, which was to take 3 lab directors, molecular biologists, into the jungle and have a traditional shaman administer ayahuasca, and to see, they all had problems in their research, they all had blockages in their research. He wanted to see if it could reveal something about the nature of plants, which is what ayahuasca is meant to do, see? So he used the proceeds of the American sales of his book in order to fund this himself. All 3 of them had breakthroughs in their research. 2 encountered plant spirits. I think 1 became a Tai Chi teacher. 1 had a divorce. Big things happened. No one wanted to publish this research. It wasn't published. It was published in the back of his own book, Shamans Through Time. So self-funded and self-published. Gabor Mate, who also was using a traditional practitioner, brought him to Canada to treat crack addicts, heroin addicts, and alcoholics. These were the results he got. Basically 60%, well, they were fantastic results that he got. He was given a cease and desist order by the Canadian government. So here we have again, ignoring this data, focusing on the theory, focusing on the idea of what a hallucinogen does. So the contraindication, this is proposed by Callaway and Grob, neither of whom are racist. It said that if you take SSRIs, if you take antidepressants, and then you drink ayahuasca, you could have a serotonin reaction, and you could die. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this idea. If you go and try and drink ayahuasca, daime, in many places, the first thing they'll ask you, are you on antidepressants? If yes, you can't drink it. So this was proposed nearly 20 years ago, over 20 years ago now. Has there been any research on this? No. Has there been any evidence of this? No, not a single report of any death or doubtless case of serotonin syndrome. The UDV never believed this. They continued serving ayahuasca to people on SSRIs. They never had a problem with it. So why do we maintain this taboo that was proposed 20 years ago by 2 white guys, never tested, when we aren't particularly interested in the taboos that indigenous people bring? I've looked through a lot of research. I haven't found a single paper that asks, are you on a sexual dieta? Are you on your menstrual cycle? What are the kind of things you've been eating, etc., etc., etc. And fatal consequences, again, 13% of Americans take antidepressants, therefore excluding themselves from the ayahuasca world, and more than 50% of suicide victims suffer from depression. So this is killing people, this structural neocolonialist. When I say neocolonialist, I'm talking about how we favor one knowledge system over another, right? We hear about, we need to have proper clinical, randomized, placebo-controlled trials. Well, you can't really do them with ayahuasca. I mean, which bit of that particular nexus of things that I took in order to treat my leishmaniasis are you going to test, and how would you test it? You can't do it. And secondly, does that mean that what the indigenous people have been learning in their perhaps 1,000 years of use, does that not count as knowledge? So what kind of analysis do we have? Mathematical analysis, we talked about, brainwave analysis. That's me in a machine on psilocybin. They didn't ask me to do any prayers or anything, sing any Icaros. They asked me to see if some chaos I was looking at, a picture of chaos, was an animate object or an inanimate object. If I had one of these machines, I would put people in there and get them to sing Icaros. Has that research been done? No. Psychoanalysis, where the voices of the spirits are dissociative identity disorder. When you have visions, what we call visions, they call hallucinations. I've heard a lot of very progressive psychoanalysts talking about a dialogue. How do you have a dialogue when the word hallucination means seeing something which doesn't exist? We need a new nomenclature. Chemical analysis. You even get this in Strassman. Rick Strassman wrote a wonderful book, and he describes why he chose to look at biblical stories as a model for the ayahuasca experience over shamanism. And he talks about how this often murderous, obsessed with its pursuit of power and sex and violence. And he says that if we're looking for a new religious model for the ayahuasca experience, it should be a progression rather than a regression. I don't know if he's read the Bible, but it's a pretty brutal book, and kind of the politics of, well, let's not go into that. Anthropological analysis. In 1886, Alfred Simpson described the inconsistency, vagueness, and superstition which pervade the savage's mind and actions. This is one of the first anthropologists that encountered ayahuasca in situ. Was he racist? In 1906, Madison Grant put a pygmy as the missing link between the white race and the apes in the zoo. Was he racist? Yeah, he was. In 2007, Jack Hunter, who's a wonderful anthropologist, submitted a chapter to a book called The Supernatural in History, Society and Culture. His chapter was rejected not because of any problems with the actual chapter, but because of publications and associations in which you present information that supports claims to the ontological reality of supernatural phenomena. Which means to say that if you present data which supports things that people in the global south, people in the ayahuasca traditions believe, you're not allowed to have it published. So I think we should be very, very careful about throwing around accusations of racism. In 2017, Chacruna published an article called Racism and the Discrimination Against Cannabis used by ayahuascas and users in Brazil, right? This is from an argument. There's two Santo Daime lineages. My lineage doesn't use cannabis. The other lineage does use cannabis, which is fine. But my lineage, we haven't accepted that. And the reason proposed by Ed McRae, who's a professor of anthropology at the Federal University of Bahia, was because of internalized racism on the part of the Daimistas. That is to say that the Daimistas were trying to brush up their image by moving away from aspects of black culture, such as smoking cannabis. This is why my lineage doesn't accept cannabis mixing with ayahuasca, according to this guy. Now, of course, we would say, and the way he argued it was saying, well, in the jungle they mix plants, therefore it's all right to mix plants. Well, in the jungle they do mix some plants. They don't mix all plants. Pretty much all of the indigenous traditions I'm familiar with will include cannabis in the dieta, for example. Those plants, well, some people may say they mix. The people who know about them, a lot of them say they don't mix. They say the spirits don't get on. So was this is it because of any specialized knowledge that we may have after 100 years of tradition and based on 1,000 years of tradition? No, it wasn't because of that. Was it because the spirits of the plants told them so? No, it wasn't because of that. It was because of internalized racism on our part, right? This is a social constructivism. This is using the explaining away aspects of the religion purely by reference to social forces going on. In the indigenous world, in the traditional ayahuasca world, we believe there are other forces that influence the construction of our rituals. So I responded to this article. In fact, I asked the editor of Chacruna, why did you publish this? Oh, to stimulate debate. Well, who's the debate going to be between? Almost no one in my lineage speaks English. Those who do, very few of them are familiar with anthropological debates. So why do you publish this? And she goes, to stimulate debate. So I responded to the article with this article, and she refused to publish it on Chacruna. I got it checked by Jeremy Narby. It was that good. So if you want to have a look at it, that is it. So what I want to conclude by saying is, are we racist? It's a question. Are we racist? No, we're trying, well, at least we're trying not to be racist. Does our science, does our scientism, does our academy have inbuilt structural elements of racism and neocolonialism? I would say it does, and there's something we should be doing about that. which is keeping our minds open. Oh, I want to say one more thing. Why are we playing this game? How powerful are scientific institutions? We've had research on two things, cannabis and global warming since the 70s, and neither of all the research we have has not changed those things at all. In England, it looks like the situation is changing. Why? Because Charlotte Caldwell, her kid had epilepsy, was having epileptic fits 30 times a day, and she bought some cannabis oil back from Canada in her luggage and declared it at customs. And it was a beautiful story that got the public enraged. It was nothing to do with the 40 years of science that we already had saying cannabis doesn't do all the things that you reckon it does. 20,000 climate scientists have signed a paper warning about the future of humanity. Has it had any effect on policy? No. Why are we playing this game? Why are we giving these people so much respect when really what does the deed is narrative, is story? So let's share our experiences. Can ayahuasca cure cancer? You can clap in 1 minute. Can ayahuasca cure cancer? The correct answer to that is, I don't know. Ask somebody who's been with the tradition for centuries. This is my book. Please read it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now we have time for some questions, as before you can address any of the members of the board. We have one here. Can someone please bring a microphone?
So I am very interested in this SSRI question. I was on an SSRI for 15 years, and because I was a physician assistant, thought I could taper myself and did it in a month, which was kind of foolish. Also, Ativan, 15 years, and then I was off in 1 month, and it was horrible. It was a very hard experience, but they said, oh, got to do it or you can't take the medicine. And so I've now been off of everything for 5 months. I've done 13 ceremonies, maybe a little too much. But now I'm suffering from not enough serotonin now, because the ayahuasca's out of me, and I have no SSRI, and I don't want to go back to a pharmaceutical. So it's been suggested maybe microdose psilocybin, microdose ayahuasca, but I do not want to go back to a pharmaceutical. But I also am curious if it really, truly, if there has been no lethal result from taking SSRI, and if that whole guidance is just wrong, because people go through a lot to get off of an SSRI to do ayahuasca. The question is whether you really need to get off of SSRIs to do ayahuasca. You're obviously depressed if you're on an SSRI to start with, and you should take ayahuasca, which boosts your serotonin anyway.
So, can you hear me if I shout? Hello? Okay. The answer is no, there hasn't been a single death. Toffoli is the guy to look at for this research. Alex, you know about his research, don't you? Look up Toffoli, who has, I think, published the UDV's findings on this. But the answer is no. There was a case in England of a suspected death. I actually know the uncle of the person who died, and it wasn't a serotonin syndrome. It was I think it was amphetamine. Yeah. No, he banged his head on the floor, and then his hippie girlfriend kept him in a yurt for 3 days and didn't get him to hospital. It was, basically no, there hasn't been one. Toffoli is the person to look up. People think I'm very, very irresponsible for saying this. Tofoli is his name.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Thank you all for your beautiful presentations. I have a question for Rita. I understand that your study was on the psychological aspects of mental health, but I found it a little bit dangerous, or I want to know what were your concerns on the bipolar or psychotic type of diseases in this study, because we know that ego dissolution is one of the phenomenological features of the schizophrenic process, and maybe these diseases are not the most prevalent, but are for sure one of the most serious and treatment resistant that we find on psychiatry. So I would like to know what's your opinion on this prevention of mental health, having this schizophrenic, for example, in mind. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I realized that I might have been more specific what I mean by the mental health disorders. I mainly meant those which are the most common, like depression and anxieties, addictions. And yeah, I think I cannot say anything about those disorders, and I think that that they may not be possible to prevent by focusing on those factors. Although it can help, but I would accept that. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Studies now focusing on bipolar disorder with ayahuasca, but well, that's just what I wanted to ask, because I deal with very, very serious psychiatric cases every day, and schizophrenic process is a very, very serious one. And I believe it's very dangerous to use these magic and wonderful substances to everyone, because we have to understand and to also pay attention to their limitations. That's it. Thank you very, very much.
I agree with you, and I'm sure that the psychedelic treatment or the psychedelic use will never be suitable for everyone. That it will be always just the group of the people which for which it's good and safe. But always there will be people which will be contraindicated to do that, either healthy or
yeah. Let's hope never. It's not never, but maybe someday it will be with some adaptations. But as this prevention massive use, I am a little bit worried. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to make an announcement. Tomorrow, the session for Hall 3, the first session, it starts actually at 9:20 and not 10:40 as it says on the program. With this, we conclude this session here at Hall 2. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for the speakers. Let's give them a round of applause.